What if a surgeon opened somebody's body and discovered something that wasn't supposed to exist? That's exactly what happened to a man named Pastor Dave after his appendix was ruptured while he was battling leukemia. The infection should have spread throughout his entire body, but instead, the surgeon found something he could only describe as tiny little shields. My name is Brian, and welcome to Immersed in Him. Every week, I search for some of the most compelling testimonies of people whose lives were transformed by Jesus Christ. Some describe miracles, some describe answered prayers. Others simply describe finding hope when they thought all hope was gone. Let's start with today's first story. Some miracles don't begin with angels or flashes of light. Sometimes they begin with something as ordinary as a stained ceiling tile. When Pastor Dave opened his eyes in the hospital room, the first thing he saw was a row of water-stained ceiling tiles. Most people would never think twice about them, but that morning, he thanked God for every little stain that he saw. Because if he could still see those ceiling tiles, it meant that he was still alive. At 39 years old, Pastor Dave wasn't expected to live much longer. Only 1 week earlier, he had completed his final round of chemotherapy after battling acute myeloid leukemia. Against all odds, it looked like he was winning. His doctors were optimistic, his blood work was improving. He had even danced with his teenage daughter in his hospital room before she had left for the prom. For the first time in months, there was hope. Then everything changed. Without warning, his appendix ruptured. For most people, emergency surgery would have been routine, but for Pastor Dave, it was almost impossible. Chemotherapy had destroyed his entire immune system. His white blood cells were nearly gone. His platelets were so low that his blood couldn't even clot. Operating on him could actually kill him. Not operating almost certainly would. Doctors inserted a drainage tube, hoping to slow the infection spreading throughout his body. But they were honest. The procedure, it wasn't a cure. It simply was buying time, hours, maybe days. As word spread, family members and people from his church filled the hospital room. Many of them came thinking they were just going to say their final goodbyes. One elderly woman from his congregation named Franny quietly approached his bedside. She looked at him with complete confidence. "Pastor Dave," she said, "I don't know why, but God told me to tell you something." Then she leaned down and whispered into his ear, "You will find that the Lord has a shield around you." She wasn't sure where the words had even come from, but Pastor Dave immediately recognized them from Psalms. "You are a shield around me, O Lord." He appreciated the encouragement, but if he was honest, he didn't think that kind of miracle happened anymore. That night, the visitors went home. His wife, Sherry, returned home to care for their kids. For the first time, he was completely alone. The hospital became quiet, and fear became deafening. He imagined his wife raising their children without him. He pictured his daughter getting married with someone else walking her down the aisle. He imagined birthdays, graduations, grandchildren, all happening without him. Every fear whispered the same message: this is the end for you. But another voice echoed through his heart: the Lord is a shield around you. Franny's words were ringing in his head. It just came over and over. He whispered those words into the darkness: the Lord is a shield around me, again and again, until he finally fell asleep. The next morning, he opened his eyes. The stained ceilings were all still there. He was alive. Then another morning came, and another. Days became weeks. No one could explain how he was surviving. His doctors later admitted that they knew of almost no one with his condition who had lived that long after a ruptured appendix. Finally, 6 weeks later, his blood count had recovered enough for surgery. The surgeons, they warned him that they had no idea what they were going to find inside once they opened him up for surgery. The damage could be catastrophic. But when Pastor Dave woke after the operation, Sherry was there holding his hand. Moments later, the surgeon walked into the room carrying several photographs that they had taken during the surgery. "I've never seen anything like this," they said. He pointed to one of the images. "Here's what's left of your appendix." Then he circled another area, and then he said, "But surrounding it," and then he paused. It was this long pause, and he had no idea what he was about to say, but the doctor said, "There was a thick wall of scar tissue." He explained that this kind of tissue normally forms only after a previous surgery, but Pastor Dave had never had a surgery there. Then the surgeon said something that he would never forget: "All of the poison from your ruptured appendix, it never spread. It was trapped inside the structure." He searched for the right words, the The scar tissue had acted almost like tiny shields, is what he said. Neither of them spoke. Immediately, Pastor Dave's mind went back to Franny's words weeks earlier. The Lord is a shield around you. She couldn't have known what the surgeon would discover. Neither could Pastor Dave. Yet somehow, before anyone had opened his body, God had already spoken the answer. To this day, Pastor Dave can't fully explain why his life was spared. Many faithful people pray for healing and never receive the answer they had hoped for. He doesn't pretend to understand the mysteries, but he does know this. When fear told him the story was over, God surrounded him with hope. When medicine reached its limits, he was sustained by God one day at a time. And when the surgeon finally looked inside, he found exactly what God had promised from the very beginning, a shield. Sometimes God's miracles come with lightning. Sometimes they come with instant healing, and sometimes they come hidden beneath the surface, quietly protecting us, long before we realize he was there all along. I just want to say before I start the story that I love the word grace, because as somebody who's suffered with addiction as well, I've gone through addiction problems almost my whole life, and I love the idea of grace because I continue to sin over and over. Hopefully it's behind me in my past. But I still remember thinking the same thing. And I was trying to find for peace in numbing myself. And so this story really resonates with me, and it might with you if you've had some of the issues that she has encountered as well. If not, I'm sure we all need grace. So this is a great story for everybody. The Gospel of Luke tells us that Jesus hung on the cross. Darkness covered the land for 3 hours. Then, with his final breath, Jesus cried out, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." Moments later, the temple curtain was torn into two. At that moment, something changed forever. The barrier between God and humanity had been removed. For thousands of years, that moment has represented hope for people whose lives seemed beyond saving. People convinced that they had gone too far, maybe made too many mistakes, destroyed too much around them. This is the story of one woman who believed that she had ruined her life forever. It wasn't until she discovered that no one is beyond the reach of God's grace. Long before prison, long before addiction, she was just a young girl searching for something that she couldn't quite explain. At 12 years old, she began experimenting with it. At first, it seemed harmless. What started as curiosity slowly became dependence, as it often does. By the time she reached her 20s, drugs were no longer something she occasionally used. They had become something like it was the center of her life. Every decision, every relationship, every day revolved around the next escape. In 2009, she married the man that she loved. And like so many couples, they dreamed of building a future together. But addiction has a way of making promises it can never keep. She remembers returning home from a trip once, not excited to see her husband, not looking forward to being home, but desperately thinking about where she could get her next high. Nothing else mattered to her. She told her husband that she was only running to the store, but instead, she disappeared. Hours became an entire weekend. When she finally returned home, 2 days later, her husband refused to let her inside. He couldn't keep watching addiction destroy the woman that he loved. Still intoxicated, she got back behind the wheel. As she crossed Florida's Buckman Bridge, she struggled to keep the car in her lane. She made it to her destination, but 10 minutes later, someone knocked on the door. It was the police. They asked one simple question: "Have you been driving on the Buckman Bridge?" Her answer changed everything. The officers placed her in the back of the patrol car and drove away. As they drove back across the bridge, she had no idea that her life was about to unravel completely. By the end of 2010, she stood at the gates of a prison. As those heavy gates closed behind her, she looked up at the guard tower and thought, "This can't be my life." Every dream, every plan, all the hopes for the future seemed like they were gone now. For many people, prison becomes the end of the story, but for her, it became the place where a new story began. Until that moment, she knew about Jesus. She heard his name, but she didn't truly know him. For the first time in her life, there was nowhere left to run, no to numb the pain, no excuses, no one else to blame, only silence. And in that silence, the weight of years finally caught up with her. The shame, the guilt, the fear, the anxiety, the hopelessness. She realized she couldn't carry it anymore. So from inside a prison cell, she prayed. Just an honest prayer. Jesus, if you can do anything with my life, you can have it. She fully surrendered. She said, I'm done trying to fix myself. I've made a mess of everything, but I believe in you, and I believe you can restore what I have destroyed. It was a prayer whispered by someone who had nothing left. And sometimes those are the prayers God answers most powerfully. Everything began changing after that moment. God began working in her life in ways that she had never expected or could even imagine. She was transferred to a faith-based prison program called Hernando. Instead of filling her heart with substances, she began filling it with scripture. Instead of chasing another high, she found herself longing simply to know God. Day after day, year after year, she read, she prayed, and she worshiped. The peace that she had searched for in drugs, she discovered in the presence of Christ. Slowly, the woman she had become began to disappear. In her place, God was shaping someone entirely new. She began seeing herself the way God saw her, not as an addict or a prisoner or as someone forever defined by her worst mistakes, but as someone deeply loved by God, deeply forgiven, deeply redeemed. When Jesus cried from the cross, "It is finished," he wasn't speaking only about that moment. He was declaring that the debt of sin has been paid for everyone. There was nothing left for her to earn, nothing left to prove, nothing she could do to make God love her anymore. And she also realized that there was nothing she had done that could make him love her any less. Looking back today, she says something that surprises many people. The greatest miracle wasn't that her circumstances eventually changed. It wasn't that addiction lost its grip on her life. The greatest miracle was what was inside of her heart, because God specializes in doing what no one else can do. He takes hearts consumed by darkness and fills them with light. He takes lives that seem beyond repair and writes new stories from the broken pieces. He turns shame into purpose, failure into testimony, prison into freedom. The world often believes that miracles only happen when diseases disappear or when impossible circumstances suddenly changed. But sometimes the greatest miracle is one that can't be seen on an x-ray or measured by a doctor. It's a miracle of a heart made new, a life restored, a soul redeemed. Because no prison is stronger than God's grace, no addiction is deeper than his mercy, and no one is ever beyond the reach of Jesus Christ. I just really like that story just because of the redemption that she felt. And I know that I've felt the same thing when I have prayed and realized that God loves me no matter what I do. All the mistakes I've made, all the mistakes I continue to make, I know that God has redeemed me, and I know that there's nothing I can do to either make him love me more or love me less.